I'm Christine. I am based at UC Berkeley, and I'm currently talking with you all from Berkeley, California, which is the unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. And today I wanted to give you all an introduction to participatory mapping and how it can be a useful tool for conservation and for employing One Health principles in conservation work. And just as an aside, the folks who put together this kind of seminar series informed me that I am already doing One Health work, despite me not knowing anything about One Health whatsoever. So I'm a brand new kind of convert to the One Health framework. So yeah, mostly participatory mapping for today. So, all right, so today's roadmap, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is participatory mapping. Some of you may have experience with that. I saw some folks that I know in the attendees list that are definitely experienced in participatory mapping, but some of you might be new for you. Then we'll talk about using it specifically for conservation. For those of you who want to use it, I'll explain some examples of participatory mapping tools that you could use in different contexts. And then we will talk about what I think is one of the most important aspects of anything participatory, which is the ethical considerations and logistics related to this ethics. And then I'll dive into a couple of case studies from Kenya and from some of the stuff we're starting in the Bay Area as well. And then we'll do some Q&A. So first, what is participatory mapping? So essentially, it is community members expressing their spatial knowledge about what is happening on the ground in their communities. So first, participatory mapping recognizes that local communities are the ultimate experts about their space. Their voices should be heard in space on maps, because maps are, that's number two, a form of power. So participatory mapping can elevate and prioritize people's views and values about where they live. If you think about any sort of urban planning, ecological planning, conservation planning, whatever it is, even transportation, I mean, just think about all the different ways we use maps to make decisions on the ground and to make decisions that affect people's livelihoods, the economy, ecology, et cetera. So this number two is kind of getting at how empowering folks to be able to express themselves through maps can really help change that kind of sociopolitical landscape and power structure. And then lastly, participatory mapping can contribute to equitable decision-making that recognizes various ways of knowing. One of my favorite books I read as I was sort of pivoting into an interdisciplinary researcher is called Objectivity. And it's essentially all about how objectivity doesn't exist. It's a whole book about it. Highly recommend reading it. And participatory mapping is just one way that kind of acknowledges that, basically allowing different ways of knowing to hold value and to be able to be seen as important. And so while participatory mapping has, in some sense, been around for a long time, the idea of integrating it into development, conservation, and other fields partially has its roots in the participatory rural appraisal movement that took off in the 1990s. And I just want to make a note that while today I'll be focusing mainly on spatial maps, there are many other types of participatory mapping that are more conceptual, like risk mapping, priority mapping, and others. So why use participatory mapping to help conservation and human-wildlife coexistence efforts? Well, we know that wildlife co-occur with people in even the most pristine landscapes. And even though early conservationists focused on maintaining a pristine wilderness and separating people from wildlife, we know that that's completely unrealistic. And we also know that interactions between people and wildlife can shape ecology at many different scales, and that these interactions can also influence and impact people's livelihoods and public health. So what does it mean to share our landscapes with wildlife? Well, wildlife have to navigate human infrastructure like roads and fences, and human activities like tourism and noise pollution, but they also have to navigate less tangible elements like human risk perceptions about and tolerance for wild animals, and how those human factors translate into exclusion and extirpation of these animals and have cascading effects on the surrounding ecology and on human livelihoods in these shared landscapes. So we can address this really enormous complexity by integrating local community perspectives with data on ecology and wildlife behavior to enhance our understanding of how humans and wildlife can share landscapes over the long term. So this is where the mapping comes in. So I wanted to show you this 2009 paper figure by Rahima White and colleagues, which argues that solutions to conservation conflicts should be spatially explicit or mapped, and they should be informed by interdisciplinary data to fully understand and address these challenges. So we should be including a myriad of spatial data like social factors, wildlife and human behavior, economics, etc., to really more justly and realistically predict and solve these conservation conflicts. And incorporating participatory mapping with other methods is one meaningful way to really understand how perceptions and values interact with and influence ecology and animal behavior, as well as the other way around. So this form of engagement can also be relevant for understanding how public health interacts with human perceptions and wildlife ecology. And we can use participatory mapping to really involve and engage communities in the research process in a meaningful way, and to gain spatially explicit community perspectives that help us as scientists to really understand the dynamics of conservation challenges, and most importantly, just and sustainable solutions to those challenges. So I just want to jump in to talk about some of the participatory mapping tools and tech that we can use to do what I've been talking about. So first, we'll talk about physical tools. So in regions where there's just a little bit of internet access, or when you have lower tech budget, you might opt for some of the classic original participatory mapping tools. And you might be surprised to learn that some of the earliest map-making tools of humankind, ground maps, as you can see here, are still used in some participatory mapping contexts today. So something that you can use to make the mapping accessible for people. Now, meanwhile, paper maps are our most common physical participatory mapping tool that we still use. I think we're all familiar about how paper maps work. I've included an example of that here on the left. But for those of you who work with historical spatial data, you know that digitizing paper maps can be a huge hassle. So fortunately, there are at least 2 initiatives that address this. So I wanted to highlight Local Ground, which was developed out of UC Berkeley, and Field Papers, which was developed out of Stamen Design in San Francisco. And they both allow you to print out your paper map, do the participatory mapping on paper, and then upload a photo of the map back into the website for easier digitization. And I'll be explaining more about how Field Papers in particular works in one of my case studies. So there are also a lot of digital tools we can use for participatory mapping, and I've highlighted just a few of them here. So most of these generally allow either the researcher or the participants to add their data to a digital map in points, lines, or polygons. Some of them, like OpenDataKit, ODK, also have survey capabilities so that you can do some really rich customized participatory GIS. And most of these, aside from Esri's ArcGIS collector, are also open source. I wanted to highlight Sapelli in particular, which I recently came across and super inspiring to me. And it's a platform from an organization called Extreme Citizen Science. It's specifically designed for non-literate participants. So this is from a project, as an example, where people can report on wildlife crime. And it shows the participant these symbols and these panels rather than words, which is pretty unique, and it addresses some of the equity issues that can be present in map making and participatory work in general. So all that is to say, there are quite a lot of different digital participatory mapping data collection platforms that have their different pros and cons and uses. And there are also a lot of examples of amazing long-term participatory mapping projects out there that you can even get involved with for some of these. So I'll dive into a couple of them just to give you an example. So first we have the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project based out of the Bay Area. We all know that we have a lot of problems with evictions and housing and tenants' rights in the Bay Area. And this is kind of a crowdsourced map about these Ellis Act evictions so that people can both kind of see where they're happening, see what the trends are, but also maybe plan ahead and be able to talk to some tenants' rights folks if they think that they're going to be facing this kind of eviction. Another example we've all heard of, I'm sure, is iNaturalist. This was actually originally developed from a guy based out of UC Berkeley. He's now working with the Cal Academy of Sciences. And this is a way for citizen scientists to go out and document all sorts of flora and fauna and get them identified by kind of the different contributors here on the platform. And you can actually download all of these data and use them for whatever you want, any sort of research studies at all. It's all freely available and it's totally amazing. Now, I also wanted to highlight a couple of use cases in participatory wildlife research and management specifically. So this example that I've given here is they were talking with indigenous groups to understand not only where bowhead whales are, but whether they are thriving and how their behaviors do or don't differ from the past. So this ended up for them opening up more research questions about there being two distinct bowhead populations instead of one, while also elevating the voices of the people that live with and rely on these animals. Another example that I really liked was that they used participatory mapping in this case study from the Peruvian Amazon to help facilitate the protection of the indigenous lands and biocultural resources in that area, since there was a plan for construction of a potentially very destructive road through the indigenous lands, and that was threatening their livelihoods, their traditions, and potentially their health. So what this does is they were essentially trying to see, okay, what exactly is threatened? What are the things that these particular folks rely on in their community culturally and from a subsistence perspective, that we can create these maps with them and pitch it to the government and these other entities about why this road shouldn't be constructed. So I thought that was really an amazing example. So also, you have all likely used participatory maps yourselves. So if you've used Waze or OpenStreetMap or some of these other popular apps, you're actually using participatory maps. Now, all of these apps allow community members to note various relevant aspects that are happening around them. So Waze, for example, lets people upload when there is a traffic accident or construction, and the app updates the traffic patterns and predictions in real time for you to use while you're driving, etc. OpenStreetMap, on the other hand, maybe some of you have used it, in some ways is an alternative to Google Maps because it allows community members to make the base map from scratch, to basically contribute roads, streets, places of interest, etc. I found that it's particularly been useful in my very rural Kenyan field site where Google hasn't been able to send their mapping vehicles that they have all around the bay that we've all seen. So since some of us here might work with wildlife, and of course my specialty is in wildlife, we have to ask ourselves, when exactly is participatory mapping appropriate for wildlife research and management? So first, we should consider the content. So we should think about what information is needed on species locations, on animal movement, on resource use, etc. Is participatory mapping the right tool to either gain that information or augment that information? And then you have to think about who specifically you need the information from and why. What are you hoping to get out of this? And will the people that you need the information from be benefiting in some way? And then another thing that I found is important to consider is community land tenure length. So, if you have folks that have been living in a place for generations, they're going to have a lot different perspective on what's going on the ground than people that have just moved in recently. And I see this a lot where I work in Kenya. There's a lot of immigration into the region. I'll talk more about that later. And you have thus kind of a lot of different types of relationships with the wildlife going on the ground. Whereas if you talk with some, Californian indigenous folks, they might have a very different, very kind of well-established idea of their relationships with these wildlife and what the wildlife are doing from their perspective. And we should also consider our positionality. So we should think about what is our decision-making capacity as a researcher, or as a manager, or as a practitioner. For me, when I was doing my participatory mapping for my dissertation, I essentially was only a student. I didn't have very much decision-making capacity, but I did have the ability to connect people with relevant government entities. And that was something that I had to really go in being very conscious of and be able to set up the mapping sessions in a way that puts my kind of positionality out there explicitly. You should also be thinking about your ability to build and maintain relationships with stakeholders. So are you able to go out into the field for a long enough period of time to build trust and maintain relationships? Are you from the place where you're doing the participatory mapping, or are you new there? All of these questions you should be asking yourself. And then you should be thinking about the flexibility of topics that you want to do for mapping. So unfortunately, for a lot of scientific research, it's really difficult to have that kind of flexibility because of funding, right? So you apply for funding with specific questions in mind, and that's what the funders expect you to do. But for participatory work in general and mapping too, we should be thinking about how we can allow for flexibility in those topics and questions and be able to maybe have an idea in mind of what we would like to learn from the community about, but then also kind of have wiggle room for people to be able to guide that process and get what they want out of it as well, which is, in my opinion, even more important. So some ethical considerations for participatory mapping, which are really, can get quite heavy, and hopefully we'll talk more about in the Q&A. First of all, you should think about who is involved, right? Who are you bringing into these mapping sessions and whose voices are going to be represented? You'll see in a bit with my case studies, I had separate sessions for men and women because of these power dynamics. But you also have to think about like who's in the room. Is it just the chiefs, the bosses? Is it a mixture of people where some people might feel like they aren't allowed to speak because of the people in power that are in the room with them? These are things you need to be really conscious about if you're going to do kind of group sessions and that kind of thing. You should also think about where and when the sessions are being held. So accessibility. I like to say, rather than bringing people to the table, try to think about ways to bring the table to the people, right? Think about ways that you can really work around what people are going to want and need in order to really be engaged in these sessions and want to show up and stay. So that's one thing I think that is one of the most difficult aspects of any participatory work. And then lastly, think about how the community is involved. Are they involved from the very beginning in the project development and the iteration of the project? Are they able to really chip in and contribute in ways that they are allowed to guide the way the project is carried out or not? And if they're not, if there's, it's spectrum, right? So if there's somewhere on the spectrum that you are, you need to be really, really honest and forthright with the community that you're working with from the very beginning about what's possible. And logistically, there's a lot of different things I could talk about, and I could tell you all sorts of stories about it, but you should be thinking about internet availability. Some of us I know work abroad, some of us work here in the Bay and elsewhere where there's plenty of internet, but your tools are going to work better. Certain tools are going to work better in certain places. You should be thinking about the tech availability and the ability to charge your tech for the field. In an ideal world, we'd all be using these, iPads and digital participatory mapping apps, but that's not always possible. And then if you're doing group sessions, you should think about the number of people participating in each mapping session, both as far as being able to have legible maps at the end, but also as far as kind of getting people to teach each other map orientation and literacy, which is my next point. So, in my sessions, I had some folks that were literate and had seen maps before and some didn't. And we had these whole map orientation sessions where we were teaching each other how to read the maps and how to navigate them. So onward, I'd like to talk about a couple of case studies where I've used some of these tools. So I'm a wildlife ecologist by training, and my research was helping me to understand the dynamics of carnivore ecology and movement in Nakuru County, Kenya. But we also wanted to understand whether the ways we were characterizing these ecological patterns on the landscape were different from how community members were actually perceiving those patterns. So before I describe this first case study, I'd like to set you up with some background. So the study site for this project is in the Rift Valley of Kenya, in and around two adjacent protected areas, Lake Nakuru National Park and Soisambu Conservancy. And Lake Nakuru National Park, which is to the west, is one of only two fully fenced national parks in Kenya. And Soisambu Conservancy to the east is a wildlife conservancy that is also a livestock ranch, and it's partially fenced. And then Nakuru City to the north is one of the fastest growing cities in East Africa, and it's directly adjacent to the national park. There's also really dense development around both protected areas with considerable immigration of people into this region. And I'll give you some context about this area to set the stage for the case study. So as you saw on the previous slide, Lake Nakuru National Park and Soisambu Conservancy seem to function as ecological islands amid an influx of human development and subdivision. And this photo is a great example of the subdivided agricultural landscapes surrounding the two protected areas. Next, Soisambu Conservancy is not just a wildlife conservancy, it also functions as a cattle ranch. It's done so since the colonial era, and it has thousands of cattle, sheep, and goats, and some agriculture. And then issues around wildlife in this area are deeply controversial. So this might look like a photo of the military, but it's actually the Kenya Wildlife Service, which is militarized largely to stop poachers. Now, because of this dynamic and the region's colonialist history, and also the sequestering of valuable remaining rangeland into these protected areas, the surrounding communities have a really complex relationship with these protected areas. And the people I know in these communities are actually really interested in getting involved in wildlife and conservation planning. And lastly, the electrified perimeter fence around Lake Nakuru National Park was put up in 1986 to deter intruders and to keep rhinos in the sanctuary, but it's also currently maintained to alleviate human-wildlife conflict and to mark the park boundary. So these kind of shifting stated purposes of the fence are really important to consider when thinking about wildlife responses to and movement through the fence, as well as people's reactions to this fence. So a little bit more background about the fence. Before we started the participatory mapping, we put up camera traps on the national park fence, and we've seen that at least 27 different mammal species are crossing in and out of the national park into the communities every single day. With spotted hyenas doing downward facing hyena, as you can see, the most often out of all of them. And spotted hyenas are known to cause a lot of conflict with livestock, so the fence's ineffectiveness on that particular front was pretty concerning. We also looked at fence maintenance for the park fence and found that maintenance is pretty sporadic and really doesn't do much. We observed only 14 fence maintenance events on all of our cameras for a whole year, and there was no real trend in terms of effect. And then the wildlife actually breached that hole again within a day, as you can see right here. So at the same time as seeing all of this, we had also noticed anecdotally that community members viewed the fence as being useful nonetheless. So we knew that people's perceptions of the fence's effectiveness might be just as important as actuality when we're thinking about conservation outcomes. So I'm going to be using the term human-carnivore conflict during my 2 case studies. So I just wanted to pause and give you a definition of that for context for those of you who aren't familiar. So human-carnivore conflict is our way of describing the negative interactions that can happen between carnivores and people or their livestock, as well as people's perceptions of risks that carnivores pose. So a negative interaction might be a puma killing someone's goat or even chasing a person while they're hiking. And it also includes human actions like human retaliation toward pumas, whether it's legal, like a permit to shoot the offending puma, or illegal, like poisoning or other methods. Meanwhile, maybe you've been out on a hike or a bike ride and you've been worried about what it might be like to encounter and be attacked by a puma, even though that event is extremely rare. But these perceptions are still very important. And that's because perceptions influence actions like retaliation, and they also influence acceptance toward carnivores and legislation about them. And that leads into the case study. So we know from our definition of human-wildlife conflict that human perceptions are important and that human perceptions can be different from what we see with scientific or recorded evidence. So we wanted to see how people's perceptions of livestock being killed by carnivores were different from the livestock killing events that the government had recorded in this region. To address this gap, we looked at 2 questions across the Kenya study site. So first, how do verified and perceived livestock predation compare spatially and in relation to ecological variables and infrastructure? And second, how do social variables correlate with quantities and distribution of perceived livestock predation? So for this study, we compiled data on verified livestock predation by carnivores. And what I mean by verified is that, for instance, someone who experienced an attack on their livestock might call Kenya Wildlife Service, and then Kenya Wildlife Service has a process to collect evidence and verify which animal was attacked and by which carnivore species. And of course, we also used participatory mapping. So we chose 16 major villages outside of the protected areas and focused on villages that were close to weak spots in the fence. And I'll intentionally dive a little bit deeper into the methods so that you can get a sense of how all of this works. So we had nearly 400 participants from these villages with about a dozen participants in each session so that the completed maps that they were drawing on would be legible to us later. And as I said before, mapping groups were gender stratified to encourage people to speak openly with one another. And then importantly, we made sure that the participants knew that we were students and that we didn't have any sway over conflict management issues. And that even though we did serve everyone lunch, there would be no compensation for participating. We also made sure that people knew that sessions were voluntary and that they could leave the sessions at any time. Now, because many people had not viewed maps before, map orientation was really important. So community members were oriented to the map by asking them to point out places of interest or popularity, like the highway to the main city, Nakuru, the churches that they were attending, Soisambu Conservancy, etc. Now, because at the time the base maps were not as detailed, we also had blown up atlases like the ones shown here, comprised of satellite images that people could refer to. And the sessions were conducted in a combination of Swahili, Ma, and English, depending on the participants' needs. So the field assistants, who were also students, would guide these sessions, but often we would see community members animatedly helping each other out to find the landmarks. And then the community members participated in one-on-one interviews, and they were assigned a unique pen color for drawing on the map so that we could anonymously associate their interview data with what they feel is important in space. And we were asking them questions about their risk perceptions about carnivores, livestock attacks, and attitudes toward carnivores. We were also asking them about where they'd prefer carnivores to live across the landscape. Now, as far as drawing on the maps, each unique question had a symbol, either a point, a line, or a polygon that was associated with that question. And community members were shown these symbols as each question was asked. And then we digitized the maps using fieldpapers.org, which I talked about before, and it uses the QR code you see and the reference points on the borders to georeference the photo of the completed map. So basically associating the photo of the map with coordinates. Now, from this process, we were able to see that about 20% of the study area showed a mismatch between people's perceptions about livestock kills and the livestock kills that were recorded by the government. So basically, the areas that you can see in red are places where people have drawn on the map that they've seen a lot of different livestock kills happening in their communities, but the government hasn't recorded those or verified those. Whereas the opposite holds true for the blue. The blue areas are where the government has recorded a lot of verified livestock kills, but the community kind of doesn't write on the map as much. So our hunch about there being big differences between these two data sets turned out to be correct. And we now know where specifically to focus these community outreach efforts that we're doing around conflict. So then we wanted to see what actually predicts the difference. And there's a few different factors we looked at, but I'll just highlight 3 of them. So we found that with increasing distance from the protected areas, both verified and perceived conflict decreased, which is what we predicted because, as you recall, there are quite a lot of crossing points in that fence. We also found that road density was positively correlated with both verified and perceived conflict. So this could be because where there are people, there are more roads. And in this region, human population density is increasing due to a boom in immigration, which I also mentioned earlier. And wildlife in this densely developed area are likely more nocturnal. So people are likely experiencing carnivore conflicts at night near their homes, rather than during the day while animals are out to pasture in these less road dense areas. But vegetation greenness had opposite effects on perceived and verified conflict. So NDVI was positively correlated with perceived conflict and negatively with verified conflict. This could be due to overinflation of perceived conflict in and near highly vegetated regions that carnivores could be more likely to use as habitat. But diving more deeply into the perceived conflict data set, what about people who are guarding their livestock actively at night but are still reporting perceived conflict? Are there any notable regions where nighttime guarding of livestock might not be working? And from this map, we actually don't see any notable clusters in perceived attacks reported by people who are guarding their livestock at night. When we used geographically weighted logistic regression, we saw that there were local regions where certain social perceptions and values might be influencing an excess of perceived conflict reports for people who guarded their livestock at night. So for instance, here, I've circled 2 regions showing clusters of perceived conflict where people guarded their livestock at night. And these clusters are predicted by these participants' beliefs that their children face threats from carnivores while traversing those landscapes. Similarly, on the second map, we can see that this cluster is predicted by the participants' beliefs that there is a shortage in wild prey in the area. So managers can use these local clusters and their very small scale predictors to decide on targeted outreach for these particular communities. So for instance, are the people in these regions facing threats from carnivores due to that fence being breached more in those areas? Or are there ways to provide these particular communities with transport for their children to get to school without needing to walk and face these real or perceived threats, et cetera? So I won't go any deeper into what we analyzed for that paper, but instead I'm going to pivot to just a few more examples of what we could do by integrating this participatory mapping data with the ecological and behavioral data in this system. So in this example, in the orange is the per camera trap night approaches of carnivores to the fence. And the purple shows a kernel density estimate of where community members have seen or heard carnivores over the year of the study, which came from the participatory mapping data. So we can see that the carnivores in this area near Mzee-Wanyama village may likely be going into the community lands and not simply crossing the fence. We can also assume that the hotspot to the southeast is due to the fact that there's no fence on the southern boundary of the conservancy, as I mentioned earlier. But what about this hotspot to the southwest? So it seems like these areas have fewer carnivores crossing according to our ecological data, but a number of things could be going on here. So first, there might be carnivores that are denning outside of the park. Second, we know that carnivores cross into Soizambu Conservancy at these areas here. So that's because the fence wasn't really robust there at that time. And it's possible that carnivores are exiting into the communities through the conservancy boundary. And lastly, we know that people are poisoning in those areas, poisoning carnivores, and that their perceptions of carnivores are very negative. So it's possible that people perceive the carnivores to be very abundant because of their negative experiences and their perceptions. And here's one more example that also showed us future directions we should consider for working with the community and the ecology in this region. So using the GPS collar data from our spotted hyenas, we determined their 95% home range and 50% core ranges from kernel density estimation. We've also mapped here the hyena sightings from our community participatory mapping data. As you can see, part of the core range of one clan is adjacent and even overlaps with two communities where people have said that they see many spotted hyenas. And that same clan, this one, moves to and from the conservancy every single day, as you can see reflected on the other map with the blue creature. And from the two sighting hotspots in the south, we've since learned that there are two hyena clans that we were unable to collar and study thus far. And we'll be trying to do that in the future. And then lastly, we can also see from this hyena's range that the community of Kikopi, which is here, might be experiencing conflict, and we should consider reaching out to them in the future for more effective community-informed carnivore management. So this is a great example of participatory mapping, not only providing data, but also providing helpful information for future research and community-based conservation planning. So our takeaways from this particular case study is that there are quantifiable spatial mismatches in verified and perceived conflict, and there are ways to predict these risk perceptions and the attitudes that influence them, meaning that those are great jumping off points for addressing conflict. Also, risk perception might not always reflect underlying attitudes toward carnivore conservation. And most importantly, integrating these disparate data streams and using inclusive spatial planning with communities can help with disentangling conflict, elevating community voices, and ideally co-creating targeted coexistence measures. So pivoting a little bit, if you've ever wondered how coyotes, raccoons, and even pumas navigate the city and its people, that's what I'm currently launching into with my new postdoc, taking these ideas home to where I've lived for a decade now, the Bay Area. So I'm working with Dr. Chris Schell. Some of you might have worked with him before. He's amazing to understand the impacts of inequality, gentrification, and other socioeconomic factors on carnivore movement and wildlife communities. And I am definitely going to be involving my own community here in the Bay in this work. So as an example of social and cultural factors influencing wildlife ecology, I just want to share Chris's paper from 2020, The Ecological and Evolutionary Consequences of Systemic Racism in Urban Environments. So essentially, it was showing how systemic racism leads into structural racism and classism, which dictates how various elements are designed and laid out and prioritized in urban environments. So that includes aspects like infrastructure, pollutants, and green space, among others. And of course, all of these influence ecology and evolution, and of course, human livelihoods. So for example, we have redlining, which was essentially a formally legislated way from the 1930s to the 60s to deprioritize Black neighborhoods for funding, suppress the wealth of Black neighborhoods, and prioritize pouring wealth into white neighborhoods. Now, these effects can be seen in urban segregation even today and have a number of ecological impacts. For example, they found that these redlined D neighborhoods have about 21% less tree canopy than A neighborhoods. And that's just the tip of the iceberg on these effects in urban spaces. So I'll be taking some of these ideas a little bit farther to understand how these factors influence human-wildlife interactions and also wildlife movement at different scales in the Bay Area and in LA. And in keeping with my focus on misunderstood animals, I'll be working pretty heavily on coyotes for the duration of the project. Now, human-wildlife conflict and interactions are particularly stark in cities. Some of you may have heard about this report of a woman hand-feeding coyotes all over San Francisco. And feeding really contributes to boldness and negative interactions. So it's a pretty big problem to have these varied perceptions and attitudes toward carnivores in cities. So I just put this example from the San Francisco coyote sighting database, which if you live in San Francisco, you can contribute to if you see any coyotes. And this is essentially saying, okay, a solo adult coyote aggressively attacked my toddler in Golden Gate Park in the middle of the day and went for the toddler's throat. And they were saying, this isn't the first time that this has happened. Why isn't anyone doing anything about it? And people like this lady on the left, unfortunately, are contributing to that kind of boldness. And there's been a lot of reported increases in boldness, according to community members all over the Bay Area, including in these various dense cities around here. So in cities, as far as mapping goes, we're also fortunate to be able to use some widely available spatial socioecological data streams to understand what's driving how carnivores are moving and interacting with people. So for our LA study, we're looking at a number of different things like housing density, infrastructure, green space, as well as ecological layers that us ecologists are used to using, like NDVI, et cetera. We can also use alternative participatory data streams that are very prevalent in cities, like Nextdoor, to understand people's perceptions and community experiences. So of course, there are a lot of limitations of Nextdoor, such as the bias in who's posting on Nextdoor. There's also a potential power of Nextdoor as a way to engage community representatives. And I included this interaction example from my old neighborhood in Oakland, where someone's saying, okay, there's a family of coyotes, it's being fed by somebody, and now they're starting to follow us down the street with our dogs, and they're getting bolder. And then they follow up and say, I approached the person who's feeding the coyotes, and he thinks he's doing the right thing, so he's not going to stop. And so as you can see, there are just so many scales of coexistence and so many different relationships with wildlife that can happen, even in the same neighborhood, that can influence how the wildlife are behaving and how they're threatening people and their livelihoods and scaring people, as well as how they're kind of surviving in these neighborhoods themselves. So we can learn about these different scales of coexistence through participatory methods and data streams in cities. And of course, I'll also be using some of the participatory mapping tools and qualitative methods I mentioned earlier. And all of this work is going to be done with community members with an emphasis on prioritizing community livelihoods, our livelihoods, because I live here, to aim toward lasting coexistence. So these types of holistic multidisciplinary efforts are particularly important because not only are conflicts between people and wildlife and all of their trickle-down effects into people's livelihoods not going anywhere, they're exacerbating with climate change. So animals are in need of more resources, or their ranges are in some cases being shifted to overlap more with people. And the wildfires present a particular challenge for California that's also exacerbated by climate change. And more generally, by 2025, it's estimated that most of the world's human populations will live in cities. So using these participatory and integrated methods in our cities might prove quite critical in our understanding of what it means to successfully coexist with wildlife. So what are some overall lessons we can learn from these processes? So first, there can be quite a lot of political considerations when conducting participatory mapping work. So for example, in the work, political issues around boundaries, where there was a lot of disagreement around village boundaries among the village chiefs, and I ended up in the middle of it. So community mapping can get you embroiled in these tough conflicts that you need to try and think of ahead of time or figure out ways to deal with them ethically and thoughtfully. Second, we need to consider our positionality in all the work that we do with people. So for example, in an ideal world, I would have been completely not present for the Kenya participatory sessions, but we needed to have me drive the field assistants around to these sites. So I'm still not sure how much I biased these results, despite a really concerted and thoughtful and conscious effort to minimize bias by explaining my positionality. There are also cultural and logistical considerations. So for instance, in some of the sessions that I've done, people feel really uncomfortable writing on top of each other's symbols on the map, even if they feel that they would need to for, say, a place of importance. So there can be these kind of cultural differences in how different groups of people approach mapping that are worth considering when you're doing these techniques. And of course, stochastic events like COVID-19 can create challenges that might threaten relationships with communities as well. And there's a lot of very good articles out there about those effects. But there are also some good lessons. People in all of my field sites are quite keen to talk about their experiences with species with which they're experiencing conflict. And in Kenya, they also discussed benefits they would like to receive from the national park. So by fostering these conversations during participatory mapping sessions, I was and am able to serve as a bridge between the community and the government agencies that were able to address some of these issues that they were facing. And the plan for the future is also to write research and working papers jointly with these communities about some of this mapped research regarding conservation planning. So we also need to remember that even the most well-meaning researchers and practitioners will not be able to do things perfectly. So it's important to make sure we can plan for and mitigate any potential challenges as much as possible before engaging a community in participatory mapping project. It's also really important to carefully consider whether participatory mapping or participatory work in general actually is the ethical choice. So for instance, are you a master's student with only a few months to conduct research in a community that you're not a part of? It's not really enough time in that instance to build trust and relationships in that circumstance. Even as a PhD student, you need to be thinking ahead of time about whether you're going to continue going back to those communities after your PhD is over. It's not just going to be helicopter science, right? So these are really, really tough and deep things that you have to be thinking about when deciding whether to roll out these projects. So ultimately, participatory mapping is a useful tool that can be used alone or in concert with ecological and other tools. And because maps are inherently subjective, yet used for many powerful political purposes, participatory mapping's most important function might arguably be political empowerment for communities. This really requires us as scientists to recognize our positionality as the connector between research and action where applicable. So with that, I'd like to thank my funders, especially Nat Geo, NSF, and the Switzer Foundation, as well as my field team and my undergrad research assistants. The list is growing longer by the day, and my amazing labs at UC Berkeley. And I will take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was fabulous. We do have some questions in the chat, which I will pitch over to you if you're ready. Ready for a Q&A? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So first question says, can you talk more about the process of linking interviews and participatory mapping? Do you consider them, meaning the interviews, an integral part of the participatory mapping process? And then second kind of part of that is, do you run into problems with people or journal reviewers being skeptical of the data collected through this type of work?
These are two fantastic questions. I am happy, Jasmine, if that's how you pronounce it. If you want to reach out to me, if you're going to do something along these lines, I can help you with like the nitty gritty logistics. But essentially, I wanted to do interviews as well as mapping because I was looking at things like attitude and demographics and things like how the children are getting to school, right? I mentioned that thing about threats from carnivores on the way to school and all of these sort of aspects that you can't really map that I wanted to be able to connect with what people were saying about what they're experiencing in space. And so I actually developed this method. It's not super rocket science, but like I'm kind of proud of it, where essentially everyone in that session, because I wanted to do group sessions, had a different colored pen, and they were able to basically we were able to link the pen color back with the interviews, because with Open Data Kit, you can take a picture as part of the interview. So you take a picture of the pen, for example, and the way that it writes. And be able to then anonymously link that, whatever that interview was, back with the map. But you won't really need that if you're doing individual participatory mapping sessions, right? So you can have just anonymize things individually and then compile it later, which would probably be a lot easier than doing the group sessions if you don't need them. And then, do I ever run into problems with people being skeptical? Honestly, I do believe that I started publishing about participatory work at the right time, when people were starting to realize that being skeptical is oftentimes racist or classist as far as participatory work goes. And I think the conservation world was one of the first early adopters of understanding that. So, and they're still working on it. It's still problematic, but like, I do think that I wonder what would have happened to try to publish these papers like a decade ago, right? Because I do feel like there's a trend, a positive trend in that way.
Thank you. Okay. Next question is from David Wolking. So would love to hear how you balance publication pressure with longer timelines around the process for participatory co-authorship across stakeholder groups.
It's a good question. I am relatively early in my career, but I have had to deal with a couple of those instances with 2 of my papers. And also like the people that I work with are 11 hours ahead in time. So it's particularly difficult, especially during COVID, right? So I think that it is, I'm an interdisciplinary researcher. So I think in some ways I'm spoiled, right? Because I can write papers that are solely about ecology. And I can meanwhile be working on these participatory papers that take a bit longer, more back and forth between co-authors, et cetera. So I'm able to kind of like work on things. Right now I have like an ecological or a behavior paper and a participatory mapping paper going at the same time, for instance, to try and like stagger some of those publication pressures. But this is probably not very reassuring, but I do believe that we are slowly shifting into people actually tangibly valuing outreach and connection. I mean, you can even see it in the grant proposals for Nat Geo these days are asking you, who are your local collaborators? How, like, we need them to sign these things to assure that you're local, what are their roles? Do you need money to pay them? You know, just like actually writing these into your grant line items is a great sign that things are slowly shifting toward like, we actually will have, you know, participatory co-authorship and co-authorship with folks where we work as something that's valued a lot more and being called out a lot more. So hopefully that'll kind of balance out the publication pressure. I'm not sure if that's reassuring though.
Okay, so I mean, we're basically almost at the 1 o'clock mark, so I think we'll probably wrap it up now. And if it's okay, would it be all right if we shared your contact information if we have folks reach out and say they want to follow up with you or have any additional questions, since 1 hour is not a whole lot of time?
Sure, yeah, you can definitely reach out to me with any of the questions.
Awesome. Okay. So I guess all we can say right now is thank you, Christine, for your time and energy today. And that was really fabulous and appreciative. And even for me, I'm not a scientist, I'm the marketing graphic design person, but it's like so interesting and exciting to hear talks like yours and learn more about what's going on, how things are improving. So for our participants, please remember to do the survey, which is in the chat here, and then be on the lookout for our next email announcements about upcoming events for our grant. And yeah, I'll share Christine's contact information with anyone. You guys can also reach out to me or to the project organizers, One Health for All at ucdavis.edu if you want us to connect you with anyone. So, but anyway, thank you so much, Christine.
Thank you all so much. I still have so much to learn. So don't be afraid if you don't know things or if you're confused. This is probably going to be a lifelong journey of learning participatory stuff. So thank you, everyone.